A natural disaster such as a tsunami, earthquake, volcano, or flood could kill hundreds of thousands, or even millions. Those figures are eclipsed by humanity's ability to harm itself with man-made disasters, whose death tolls might reach into the tens of millions, whether caused by mistake or malice. Man-made disasters have few peers, a massive asteroid wiping out life on Earth perhaps being a notable exception. When it comes to deadliness, following are 20 things about some of history's more notable man-made disasters. Number 20. After kicking off a disaster, Soviet authorities shifted the blame to the peasants. Collectivization's turmoil resulted in a poor 1932 Ukrainian grain harvest yield. Soviet authorities got a hold of only 4.3 million tons, as opposed to 7.2 million tons a year earlier. Food rations were slashed in the cities, where many starved that winter. The disaster had begun and it was about to get far worse. To channel the urban industrial workers' ire away from Stalin's government, a propaganda campaign blamed the food shortages on counter-revolutionary peasants. Peasants were accused of hiding the harvested grain and potatoes to produce an artificial shortage, then cash in on the higher prices, even if it cost the lives of starving urban workers. The propaganda succeeded in riling up the industrial workers, and before long the urban proletariat were hopping mad at the peasants, blaming them for their hunger pangs. When the authorities organized them into special brigades and columns to go into the countryside to help confiscate grain, the workers were in no mood to listen to the peasants' protestations of poor harvests and the lack of grain to meet the set quotas. Number 19. Soviet authorities preferred to let millions starve to death rather than allow knowledge of the disaster to spread. By early 1933, Stalin's terror famine was in full swing. Thousands, most of them peasants in the countryside, were dying every day, collapsing from starvation and its attendant consequences. However, the steadily growing disaster did not halt the forced collectivization, or the forced confiscation of grain and foodstuffs from peasants, who had no surplus to spare. As news leaked of what was going on, Soviet authorities denied the Catastrophi's existence, labeled it fake news, and refused humanitarian aid from the International Red Cross and other NGOs. Amidst an information clampdown, the Ukraine and southern Russia, the regions most impacted by the famine, were put under lockdown. Travel to and from the famine zones was restricted, trapping and condemning to death millions who might have survived had they been allowed to leave for parts of the USSR where food was more available. Stalin and his henchmen preferred the deaths of millions to a PR disaster if so many eyewitnesses were allowed to spread their knowledge of the catastrophe taking place in the workers' paradise. Number 18. At the peak of this disaster, tens of thousands starved to death each day. Stalin's terror famine reached its peak in June 1933, when an estimated 28,000 died of starvation each day. That was nearly 1,200 deaths every hour, or 20 every minute. Millions died of straightforward starvation, as their hungry bodies first consumed their fat reserves, then their muscles before their lives were extinguished. Others fell to illnesses that their malnourished bodies were unable to resist. Yet more succumbed to waves of epidemics, such as typhus, that swept the Ukraine and southern Russia during the disaster. The final death toll is unknowable, but in the Ukraine, the tally ranges from a low of 3 million according to conservative modern estimates, to a high of 10 million. Number 17. Was this man-made disaster an accident or deliberate genocide? Stalin's terror famine is a bone of contention to this day between the Ukraine, where it is known as the Holodomor, derived from a term meaning to kill by starvation, and Russia. Kiev views the disaster as a deliberate genocide against the Ukrainian people. It contends that industrialization was implemented despite knowledge that it would lead to famine, and that Stalin had used famine as a weapon against Ukraine's peasants. Moscow denies that the famine had been artificial, and counters that other Soviet republics suffered from famine as well. Depending on how one defines genocide, a credible argument could be made for either position. Either way, Stalin's industrialization and forced collectivization policies set the stage for catastrophe. Then once the famine began, Soviet actions made things worse, confiscating food from peasants who hardly had enough to feed themselves, turning down international humanitarian aid, and preventing people in the starving regions from leaving, led to many avoidable deaths. Number 16. Japan's underestimation of American might led to disaster. During World War I, Japan and America fought on the same side. By the 1930s, the two countries were rivals, steadily inching towards war. In 1941, Japan was bogged down in a quagmire of a war in China, with no end in sight. It had recently been hit with US and British sanctions, including an asset freeze that crippled its trade. In one of history's worst decisions, the Japanese government decided to solve its problems by starting a war with America. The result was a disaster for Japan. The prelude was American displeasure with Japanese aggression in China, first by seizing Manchuria in 1931, followed by an outright invasion in 1937. In those days, because of decades of American missionary work, America had sentimental ties to China in addition to economic ones, and there was a powerful China lobby in the U.S. Japan made things worse in 1940 by seizing French Indochina, which destabilized the entire region. Aside from further proof of Japanese aggression, it brought Japanese forces uncomfortably close to America's colonial possessions in the Philippines, and British ones in Malaya and Burma. Number 15. U.S. sanctions took the Japanese government to the edge. America responded to Japan's seizure of French Indochina with severe sanctions that bit deep. Until Japan withdrew from China and French Indochina, the U.S. embargoed the sale of products vital to Japan, particularly oil, and froze Japanese assets. The British and Dutch, whose Dutch East Indies, today's Indonesia, oil fields fueled Japan's economy, followed suit. That cost Japan 75% of her overseas trade and 90% of her oil. The loss of trade was bad enough, the loss of access to oil was worse. Japan had oil reserves for only 3 years of peacetime consumption, or a year and a half months of wartime consumption. Once the reserves ran out, Japan's economy would simply crash. That presented Japan with a dilemma: bow to the sanctions or forcibly seize the resources, particularly oil from the Dutch East Indies and rubber from British Malaya, that her economy needed. Japan's rulers feared that they would be reduced to an American client state if they caved. What was to stop the U.S. from coercing Japan with sanctions again in the future? Between that pride and the fear of losing face, Japan's rulers chose war. Number 14. Japan's response to U.S. sanctions brought disaster upon its head. The Japanese hoped for a short war against the U.S. and her allies, with a few severe blows at the outset to bloody the American giant's nose, and let it know that Japan was serious. They would then seize and establish a defensive perimeter far out into the Pacific and Asia, behind which they would wage a defensive war. The Americans, merchants at heart and thus driven by rational cost-benefit calculations, would eventually conclude that the war was not worth the effort, and negotiate a settlement. Things did not turn out that way. After going on the offensive and winning a series of stunning victories in the war's first 6 months, Japan suffered her first major defeat at the Battle of Midway in June 1942. As the U.S. mobilized for war, its advantages in industry and manpower began to be felt. America treated the Pacific theater and the war against Japan as secondary to the European theater and the war against Germany. Nonetheless, America's industrial might allowed her to pour massive resources into the lower priority Pacific theater that were still greater than anything that Japan could match. Number 13. America's resources and industrial might were beyond anything that Japan's rulers had imagined. To put in perspective the disparity between Japanese and American resources, we can compare each country's aircraft carriers in a mostly naval conflict in which flat tops proved decisive. Japan began the war with 10 carriers, including what it started with plus what it produced during the war. Japan had a total of 15 large fleet carriers, 5 light carriers and 5 escort carriers known as baby flat tops. America started the war with 7 carriers. By the time the conflict was over, it had built an additional 160. They included 24 fleet carriers capable of carrying 90 to 110 planes, 9 light carriers capable of carrying up to 35 planes, and about 125 escort carriers capable of carrying 24 to 30 planes. Against such resources, and well-trained and well-equipped men to use them, Japan stood no chance. America went on an irresistible counteroffensive that gathered steam and pace as it went along. By 1945, it was obvious to all but Tokyo's leadership that Japan had lost the war. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki finally forced the Japanese government to face facts, realize that they had brought disaster upon their country, and throw in the towel. Number 12. China's rough 19th and 20th centuries. China had a rough 19th century, and the 20th century was no better. From a pinnacle of global wealth and power, the country declined during the 1800s into a powerless giant, and a plaything for foreigners to push around and exploit at their pleasure. The 1900s, if anything, were worse. The 20th century began with a revolution that was promising at first, but eventually produced chaos and widespread or wider spread misery. The imperial dynastic system that had governed China for over 2,000 years was overthrown, to be replaced by a modern republic. However, the republic quickly fractured into regions ruled by exploitative warlords, whose abuses were only slightly alleviated by a notoriously corrupt nationalist government that nominally unified much of the country. Then came a foreign war with Japan in which Chinese perished by the tens of millions, and a civil war between the communists and nationalists. The communists won, and finally asserted powerful centralized control that seemed to end the chaos, until they imposed their own chaos with ambitious, but poorly thought out plans that produced disaster. Number 11. A tyrant's ambitious but poorly thought out plan led to disaster. China's communists led by Mao Zedong seized power in 1949, referring to the period of Chinese weakness. Before their victory is the century of humiliation. The communists set out to restore the country's standing as a global power. That could only be accomplished via rapid and massive industrialization. Other countries had industrialized gradually, by accumulating capital and buying heavy machinery. China had neither the time nor the money. Its population was rapidly outstripping the available resources, and it was too poor to accumulate enough capital anytime soon for the massive industrialization necessary. So Mao and his communist acolytes decided to mobilize China's vast population. They would use labor-intensive means of industrialization that emphasized manpower, of which China had plenty, instead of machinery and industrial plant, of which China had little. Thus was born the Great Leap Forward in 1958, a revolutionary campaign to rapidly transform China from an agrarian economy into an industrial giant. Unfortunately, Mao's understanding of economics was faulty, and his expectations were wildly unrealistic. The result was disaster on a massive scale. Number 10. The Great Leap Forward's DIY home steel furnaces. A hallmark of the Great Leap Forward was Mao's brainstorm about increasing steel production. A benchmark of industrialization, Mao figured that China did not need to wait for the development of infrastructure such as steel plants or the training of a skilled workforce. Instead, the intrepid Chinese could produce steel by using blast furnaces in the back of their communes, literal do-it-yourself backyard furnaces. People used whatever fuel they could get their hands on to power the furnaces, from coal to wooden furniture to the wood of coffins. When they lacked iron ore, they melted whatever steel objects they could find to produce steel girders. The results were less than what Mao had hoped. Number 9. DIY home steel furnaces turned out to be a bad idea. Making steel is complicated, something that Mao and his fervent followers ignored when they pushed the idea of DIY backyard furnaces. The steel girders produced were of low quality and cracked easily. Technically, what came out of the backyard furnaces was not even steel, but pig iron, which had to get its carbon removed to become steel. In some regions with little metalworking tradition or an understanding of metallurgy, the pig iron produced was too useless to get turned into steel. The backyard furnace fiasco was not the worst part of the Great Leap Forward, however. Mao and his followers sought to revolutionize China's countryside, where most of the population toiled as peasants, so they prohibited private farming and ordered mandatory agricultural collectivization, combining communities' private plots into big fields belonging to the entire community. As with Stalin's collectivization, the result was disaster, but on a far greater scale. Number 8. Mao's collectivization disaster killed more people than Stalin's collectivization. As with the Soviet Union's collectivization in the 1930s, China's collectivization a few decades later rested on the hopes of higher returns from economies of scale. Big collectivized farms in theory should be more efficient and productive than small individual peasant plots. However, poor planning led to poor implementation of China's collectivization, and the big fields ended up yielding less than private plots. Additionally, the Great Leap Forward emphasized ideological purity and fervor rather than competence. So collectivization was led by enthusiastic and zealous overseers instead of capable and competent managers. A series of natural disasters from 1959 to 1961 made things worse. The result was history's greatest man-made disaster. By 1960, it was obvious that the Great Leap Forward had been a bad decision, but by then it was too late. Diverting labor from farms to ill-advised industries such as backyard furnaces, plus the disruptions of collectivization, combined to produce a catastrophe. From 1959 to 1962, about 20 million Chinese starved to death, with some estimates going as high as 50 million. Number 7. An emperor's hubris led to one of history's most stunning defeats. In 1812, France's Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte made what turned out to be one of history's worst decisions. At the start of that year, Napoleon bestrode Europe like a colossus, and was at the height of his power. Then he invaded Russia with about 658,000 men at the time, the biggest army ever assembled. By the end of 1812, Napoleon had endured a catastrophic defeat. He lost most of his army, and began the downward slide that would culminate 2 years later in his exile to St. Helena. The disaster can be traced back directly to Napoleon's own hubris and wishful thinking. Number 6. Nepotism set the stage for a French disaster. Napoleon's disaster in Russia was caused by not just one bad decision, but by a whole series of bad decisions. L'Emperor's first bad decision was his poor choice of subordinates. Napoleon's strategic goal was to bend Russia's Tsar to his will by decisively defeating the Russian army as soon as possible. However, Napoleon appointed his unqualified stepson, Prince Eugene de Beauharnais, to a major command. Early in the campaign, Napoleon maneuvered the Russians into a situation that should have forced them to stand their ground and fight the decisive battle that the French emperor should have, but didn't. Napoleon's inexperienced stepson screwed up his part of the plan, which allowed the Russians to escape. Napoleon then plunged into Russia, chasing after the Tsar's army. The Russians retreated for hundreds of miles, refusing to give battle and scorching the countryside behind them. L'Empereur had planned to halt at Smolensk, halfway to Moscow, go into winter quarters, and resume the campaign the following year. Once in Smolensk, however, Napoleon committed his second mistake by deciding to continue on to Moscow and into the jaws of disaster. Number 5. Napoleon was a genius, but in 1812 he kept piling one mistake atop another. On September 7, 1812, the retreating Russian army finally turned around to fight Napoleon at Borodino, near Moscow. Napoleon won a tough fight but not a total victory. At the decisive moment, L'Empereur made his third bad decision by wavering. He refrained from his usual tactic of sending in his elite imperial guard, kept in reserve, to finish off the reeling enemy that prevented the victory from becoming a complete one that could have won the war. The battered Russians were able to retreat and thus live to fight another day. Napoleon marched into Moscow and assumed that the Russians would sue for peace, now that he held their capital. He made his fourth bad decision by waiting in Moscow for Russian peace feelers. As winter drew near, the Russians strung Napoleon along, but no more than he strung himself along with wishful thinking of a negotiated peace long after it became clear that the Russians were not interested. By the time Napoleon accepted that there would be no peace and marched back to Smolensk, it was too late. His unprepared army was caught by winter during the retreat. Number 4. From the sublime to the ridiculous is only one step. Napoleon's retreat from Moscow during winter was made worse by his final bad decision. This one in his choice of route. L'Empereur had the choice of two routes, and ended up taking the one that was struck by severe winter storms. The route he did not take saw little snow that year. Most of Napoleon's army starved or froze to death during the retreat, or were killed by Cossacks who harried the rear and flanks of the retreating columns. Napoleon had marched into Russia with a grand army numbering 685,000 soldiers. He came out with only 35,000 Frenchmen still under his command, with the remainder either dead, over 400,000 deserting or switching sides. Reflecting upon the disaster, Napoleon commented, "From the sublime to the ridiculous is only one step." Number 3. The myth that the atomic bombing of Japan was unnecessary. After World War II, a myth grew that the atomic bombing of Japan was unnecessary because Japan was on her last legs and about to surrender. Supposedly, the Allies could have blockaded Japan, and the Japanese government would have given in. That might have held water if the war had been confined to Japan itself, where the Japanese could have been isolated. Unfortunately, that was not the case. At war's end, Japan still held an extensive empire in the Pacific and Asia, in which hundreds of millions of conquered subjects were forced to endure a barbaric occupation. Additionally, millions of Japanese soldiers were still fighting Allied forces in China, Burma, and in the Pacific, whether or not Japan was blockaded, and it was the war still went on elsewhere. Also, the Japanese held hundreds of thousands of Allied POWs, who were daily subjected to brutal treatment. In short, every day the war continued was another day in which millions suffered, and in which thousands more became casualties. Number 2. History's worst translation mistake led to disaster for hundreds of thousands. Given Japan's reduced but still great power in 1945, America and her allies correctly treated Japan as a formidable foe, who was inflicting significant harm every day, and would continue to do so indefinitely if not stopped. So the Allies were not mistaken in dealing with Japan as a menace that needed putting down ASAP. However, a simple mistake in translation might have determined when and how America went about putting Japan down, and led to the decision to atomically bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As such, it might have been the most momentous translation mistake in history. The result was disaster for hundreds of thousands of innocent Japanese. Number 1. What's in a word? On July 26, 1945, the leaders of the US, UK, and the USSR issued the proclamation defining terms for Japanese surrender, also known as the Potsdam Declaration. It was a blunt statement from America, which had successfully tested the atomic bomb 10 days earlier, and her allies calling for Japan's surrender. The ultimatum warned Japan that if it did not surrender, it would face prompt and utter destruction. The declaration's terms were hotly debated within the Japanese government. Subsequently, Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki stated at a press conference that Japanese policy towards the declaration would be one of mokusatsu. It was a Japanese word meaning that he had received the message and was giving it serious consideration. Unfortunately, Japanese is a subtle language in which the same word could convey a variety of meanings. Another meaning for mokusatsu is to contemptuously ignore, and that was the meaning that American translators gave U.S. President Harry Truman. 10 days later, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay flew from Tinian to drop an atomic bomb on Hiroshima.